Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Big Questions, Small Steps. My name is Amanda and I'm glad you could join me today. I have a confession to make. Someone called me out on my apparent bias between people who practice Catholicism and the Protestant community. Someone, aka my amazing boyfriend, noted that when I seem to talk about Christianity, I constantly make a comparison or make sure that it's very blatantly obvious how Christians or Protestants and Catholics are different, even though they're still under the same branch of Christianity. So I'm going to give a little background today and try to remove some of my bias. So I'm going to share with you my experience working with the Catholic faith, and then I'm going to back up and give you the history of how the different movements in general came from Christianity and what their differences were, what happened when. And then we're going to go over the 5 main aspects of Protestants in general that seems to dictate everything. And then we're going to also dive into saints, because that's a big difference between Catholics and Protestants as well. So we've got lots to cover today. So shall we get started? Okay. So full disclosure, let's start with my bias. So growing up, I was a member of a Christian church called United Church of Christ. And that church, I was a part of it for 40-ish years. And I grew up in the same church. I was baptized in that same church. I was confirmed in that same church. I taught Sunday school. I taught confirmation. I was active in that church. And so as being active and getting older and taking on different roles, I got to learn more about how the different churches interact together. And in my small town, the Protestant church, or the UCC church, because we have a lot of churches in my small town. So we have a Protestant church known as the UCC on one side of the road, and directly across from it, on the main road in town, is a Catholic church. So growing up, there was a lot of animosity between the two churches. And I really didn't think anything of it at the time. At first, I thought that the people at my church were just angry and irritated because the people from the Catholic church were parking in our parking lot. So that's the first rub that I noted. And I thought it was kind of weird because we don't have that big of a town and there's places to park on the street, but people would get very, very vocally agitated about the people from the other church parking in our parking lot. Like, so much so that they were talking about putting bumper stickers on people's cars saying proud to be UCC, and like doing different things that would show pride in being a part of the UCC church, just to irritate or get underneath the skin of the people who were Catholic. Okay, that's not very nice thing to do. It's not necessarily a Christian thing to do, but that's kind of what the general undertone was. There would be talk about, oh, well, you know, the parking lot is full when we get started with church, but the Catholic Church got out slightly after our worship started because they started earlier. And then by the time our worship service would get out, people would make comments about how, oh yeah, now there's all this space. I wonder who was here. And just always little digs. And if the Catholic Church had something going on in town, you didn't go unless you were Catholic. You didn't. If you were any other religion or practice, you didn't go. You didn't go to Catholic things. So it was just kind of like, oh, that's not for us. That's not our thing. I didn't think much of it. Switched to when I entered middle school, we had a lot of dances. My class that I was a part of really enjoyed getting together and having dances because we're in middle school and it's a small town and there's nothing else to do. So we would get together and have dances and hang out and stuff like that. So we would have dances at the school, and at the United Church of Christ that I was a part of, we would host the dances sometimes. And everybody was welcomed. It wasn't a big deal. We served snacks, all that stuff. And then the Catholic Church decided they were going to do it, but they only let people who were Catholic come to the dance. So it felt kind of exclusive and like we weren't good enough to come to the dance. So again, that's just my perception as a middle schooler. I don't know if that's the truth of what happened. Perhaps planning fell through. Perhaps there weren't people to work it. I don't quite know. All I know is my perception as a middle schooler was they didn't want us to be part of it. Okay. Going through the high school years, I entered my confirmation, and in the United Church of Christ, when I was confirmed, we were confirmed at 8th grade at that point. And so we had different people from different backgrounds that would come and support us on our confirmation day. And there would be people who were in the Catholic faith. I have friends that are Catholic, and they would say how they have to wait because they need more time to get their relationship with the Lord. Now, it could have just been the way I was feeling like I was less than. It could be that that was the phrase that they were told to say. It could be a variety of different reasons, but it came across as you're less than, and that divide was just, it was there. I could still be friends with them absolutely fine, but it's not like I would want to necessarily go to their church, because when you're kind of rejected, or if you feel rejected, you don't necessarily want to be a part of that, right? So I finished high school, started college. I was teaching Sunday school classes. I started teaching confirmation classes. And in the confirmation classes, I taught a section called Faith in Action, where it basically was the last portion of their confirmation time, and we went and we explored different faiths and different practices to help the students figure out where they fit, where their beliefs landed in a variety of different aspects. So we reached out to the Catholic Church, of course, because it's right across the street, and we reached out to a couple of different ones because if your small town is anything like my small town, there seems to be like an invisible wall that surrounds a small town, and sometimes people are afraid of going outside that wall, or they're a little bit reluctant to. So we would go and we would visit religious services in a variety of different places. Some close, some far away, some in city, some not in city. And one of the ones on our list every year was the Catholic Church. So I reached out to the Catholic Church, and I reached out to one out of our city first, and I was turned down. It was the only church at that time that I was turned down from. They said we would be too much of a distraction. Okay. Us coming and participating in your service is too much of a distraction. Okay. I didn't feel that same way, but that was their decision. That's fine. And then I reached out to another Catholic church, and their response was, this isn't for you. You're not a Catholic, you're not a member here, this isn't the place for you. No. So again, felt kind of off-put. But at that time I had went to enough worship spaces that I knew that we weren't a very big distraction, and I knew that there were more similarities than differences. So again, I reached out to another church, and I reached out to the Catholic Church that was right across the street from us because I wanted to start outside of the city, and they welcomed us over to come. So that was great, interesting experiences. They showed us around all this other stuff. They, of course, said, oh, well, we should come and we should come see your service. That never happened, but whatever. I say that to say that even when I was in confirmation, the pastor at that time shared that there had always been some animosity or some rub between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. We literally were right across the street from each other. And I have to think that's purposeful because my church was built prior to the Catholic Church, and they actually have a very similar name, the Catholic Church and the United Church of Christ Church. So I don't know if that was a planned thing or not, but it seems too coincidental to not have had some kind of plan. Now, the pastor, when I was in confirmation class, he did share that, there was a lot of history and animosity growing up, to the extent that the pastor from the United Church of Christ Church and the priest from the Catholic Church, at one point, they had what was called an ecumenical clergy group. So basically all the clergy in the area kind of got together and talked about different things. And these two individuals knew that there was this animosity, whether real or interpreted, by the congregations and the community at large. That's the right words for it. So they developed a plan that it was, I want to say it was every Tuesday at noon. They would both walk to the center of Main Street, exchange cups of coffee, and then walk back to their respective churches. They didn't say anything. It wasn't like it was announced, but it was basically a way of getting the community to acknowledge that the other side wasn't that bad. There was a lot of animosity there. So long story short, I think some of that bias comes out in my presentations, and I apologize. By no means do I have anything against anyone who practices Catholicism. There's just been a very, very direct link between the two. And I wanted to make sure, out of respect, that I shared that they're different. They're not the same. A lot of Protestants are the same. Now, if you remember, in an earlier episode, I explained that United Church of Christ is technically not Protestant. Technically, they're part of the Anglican denomination, which is a direct offshoot of Catholicism. However, the church that I was a part of would claim Protestant over Catholic any day of the week, even though the website says differently. So we claim that we were Protestant, even though the United Church of Christ website says differently. So that's the story of my bias. Shall we get into the real story now? Okay, so after Jesus died, there was this man named Paul, and he basically raised Christianity, and we're supposed to be doing this like Jesus, and we're supposed to be doing this like Jesus. I'm going to do a whole separate video on Paul, but basically Paul went to Rome. He was deemed a really important guy. He was actually the first pope, and he was the one that organized it all. Okay, so that was the Catholic Church. There was the Holy Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, that whole setup, okay? And they were doing things, they were operating by themselves for a while, and then there was this man named Martin Luther in 1517. He didn't like some of the things that the Catholic Church did or said. So he put a 95 thesis or 95 problems he had with the church, and he posted them on the church door. And that was commonplace. It was kind of like the bulletin board. If you wanted help with anything, if you had questions about things, if you wanted to discuss things, you would post it on the door. It wasn't like he was spray painting it on their wall or anything. No, he just posted on the door like everything else would. The three main things that Martin Luther had a problem with was, number one, the authority of the Pope, and particularly the authority of the Pope to forgive sins on God's behalf. He didn't think that the Pope should have that jurisdiction, that only God could do some things. Number two, he did not like that in the Catholic community they paid for what's called indulgences, or you're basically paying for past or future sins. It's basically like that's how you could get rid of your sin, by paying for it. He didn't think that was right. He didn't think that was biblical by any means. He just seemed like that was not okay. And the third thing he really didn't like was he didn't like the spiritual hierarchy. In particular, he didn't like that monks and nuns were higher than everybody else. He was still okay with priests being seen as more reverent individuals, respecting their knowledge base, but he did not like that because somebody chose to be a monk or a nun, they were viewed higher than a farmer, for example, who raises crops to feed people. He didn't like that. He didn't like that spiritual hierarchy. So he posted his 95 Theses. He was actually a monk at the time when he did it, so it caused quite the stir. And yeah, he eventually was asked to leave the Catholic Church. He started a group called the Lutheran Church, and he started that. Now, shortly thereafter, in the 1520s and 1530s, they're not quite sure on the exact time, but a man named John Calvin came about, and he said, yeah, a lot of what Martin Luther said was absolutely right, but I think there's a little bit more. I have questions with this, and this. So let's talk about what he had questions with, okay? So his big thing was predestination. He believed that when you were born, God had already decided if you were going to go to heaven or hell. He already decided it. And he preached that you have to work hard in your lifetime to try to change God's mind on if you were going to hell. So that's basically where he came out. He said, well, no, I think when people are born, God already has determined, is this going to be a good person, a bad person? If they're a bad person, are they able to work hard, persevere, and kind of change their fortune, for lack of a better term, okay? So that got a big spur of people, because they basically said, well, if things aren't going your way, it's God testing you, and you just need to work harder. So a lot of the people in the Midwest in particular still have that mentality of they have to be a hard worker because it means something. So that can actually date back all the way to John Calvin. Another thing that Calvin differed from Martin Luther and Catholicism on was regarding who should have control over church decisions. So in the Catholic Church, the Pope has ultimate control over church decisions. In the Lutheran Church, the Synod has control over church decisions. And John Calvin said, no, this doesn't make any sense. If it's a church decision, the church should have control over the decision. Whether you need a new pastor, whether you want to close your church for lack of membership, things like that. He wanted the church to have control. So that was a big change for Martin Luther. In the Lutheran Church still today, if they need a new pastor, they contact the Synod sends somebody. They don't necessarily filter out different people. I think they might be able to say yes or no, but basically they put out the call and one shows up. Okay, so John Calvin basically said that. Some of the things that caused his congregation of Calvinism to kind of split off further in Protestants is one of 4 areas. Okay, so there are 4 different areas, and they kind of all filter out. So they wanted independent relationships with God. They didn't want to have a mediator. They wanted to have personal responsibility for their faith. So in Catholicism, for example, if you choose to leave the Catholic faith tends to feel like they failed, they didn't do something right, because they couldn't keep you. But the Calvinist movement wanted you to feel like you were responsible for your own faith. Wherever you chose to go, if you were a good or a bad person, they wanted you to know and have that responsibility of you being in charge of your own faith. Okay? They also wanted to note that the Bible was the source for wisdom. They would use that frequently. They would go back and seek answers from the Bible. They didn't want to rely on saints. They didn't want to rely on the Pope. So by comparison, in the Catholic faith, if they were struggling with something, they would pray to St. Anthony to help them find something, or they would ask the Pope for their guidance on this. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to rely on just the Bible. Okay? That was their change. And then lastly, they wanted the freedom to practice as they saw fit. So in Catholicism, they have a very specific order of worship that they go through every single time. And under John Calvin, they wanted, because church decisions, again, at the church level, they wanted to be able to practice and design things as they saw fit. So if they wanted more music in their service, then they did more music. If they liked a certain verbiage for prayers, then they used a certain verbiage for prayers. If they liked this prayer over the other prayer, then they would use that one, giving them that decision, that freedom. So that was the different aspects of Calvinism and what kind of drove them. Now, from those 4 things, you can very clearly see that it wouldn't be difficult to kind of splinter off from there, especially with the freedom to practice. If you have different practices or different preferences for practice than your neighbor, it's very easy to see how that thread that held you all together can slowly start to separate into slightly different ways. So different movements coming about. Now, as Protestants, I know I'm getting long, I apologize. As Protestants, they stand on 5 solaces, they're called. So it's basically 5 beliefs of Protestants in general. And then how they interpret them and what that looks like is the little differences or idiosyncrasies between all the different movements or different denominations. Okay, so let's talk about the 5 solaces. The first one is, in order to get to salvation, you have faith alone. Your belief in Jesus Christ, your belief in God, just your faith will save you. Whereas in the Catholic Church, now again, I'm going to do this polar opposite just so you can understand the differences. In Protestant churches, it's by faith alone. In the Catholic Church, it's by faith and good works. So in the Catholic Church, it's not just you're being a good person, you believe, it's going to worship. It's participating in the sacraments. It's things like that. It's giving to the poor. So just faith for Protestants, faith and actions for Catholics. Okay? That's one of the big differences. That's a solace. That's what it's called, for the differences for Protestants. The next one is Protestants believe that salvation, or being saved, is through God's grace and by God's grace alone. You can't be saved without God's grace. Now, in the Catholic faith, they believe that you're saved by the church. You're saved through grace by the church. You need the church or you're not going to be saved. So again, if you flip back to Calvinism, they wanted that personal relationship. They wanted that personal responsibility. So in the Protestant movement, salvation is through God's grace alone. So by you having God's grace, you can be saved. In Catholicism, it's you're saved by God's grace, but you can only access that through the church. Make sense? So there's that little bit difference. The third solace is that the Bible is the sole infallible source of authority. So only the Bible. That's all you got. You don't have anybody else to go on, just the Bible. Whereas in the Catholic faith, they have the Bible, but they also heavily rely on the Pope. What the Pope says, what the Pope suggests, his guidance as well. And Protestants don't have anything to do with the Pope. They don't see him as anything special. Again, going back to the spiritual hierarchy that Martin Luther didn't like initially, and then John Calvin just initiated more of it. They don't like that spiritual hierarchy. So in Protestants, the Bible is the sole infallible source of authority. Only the Bible. Catholics, it's the Bible, yes, but more so the Pope. If the Pope says no fish on Fridays during Lent, they're not having fish on Fridays. The Protestants learned that the Pope said no fish on Fridays basically to help the congregations not feel bad about not being able to provide meat for their families. So they said, okay, just do fish on Fridays for Lent to kind of give them a buffer. He kind of took the heat for it. Whereas Protestants are like, that's not in the Bible. I'm not following that. No. So that's the difference there. Okay. Number 4. This is a big one. Number 4 is the Protestants believe that Christ is the only mediator between God and man. Only Christ. So if you need to talk to God, you got to go through Jesus in Protestants. Okay. In Catholics, or the Catholic faith, they use saints, they use Jesus, they use Holy Mother Mary. They have a lot of intermediates that they can use. So that's just a difference. Catholics can use saints. Protestants don't use saints. They believe Jesus is the only one that can go in between. Okay? And then the 5th one, Protestants say God has the glory alone. So God is the only person who should be praised. Now they kind of spin that, and sometimes they go and they praise the Trinity, or God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus, and some will mix that up. But God is the only one to be praised. And on the Catholic side, they will pray to Mary, they will pray to saints, they will pray to angels. So they have different people in there as well, different ways that they can gain insights. Okay, so that's the 5 solaces, slightly different ways of looking at things. Not saying one is better or worse than the other, just trying to help us understand. So we talked a little bit about saints, and how in the Protestant faith, they believe that Jesus is the only moderator. And in the Catholic faith, they will use saints to kind of talk to God for them. They believe that saints have a more direct contact with God. Saints are heard more readily by God as far as questions that they might have. Okay, so in the Catholic Church, to be a saint, you have to be dead, and you have to be canonized as a good person. So you have to be recognized by the church as doing such a good deed. You are such a good human that this is recognized by the Pope and by other people, like, yes, you are a saint. Not everyone will be saints. Not everyone will live up to that space, but you have to be dead. You have to be dead, and you have to be recognized by the church in order to be a saint in the Catholic faith. Okay? In the Christian faith, they don't worship saints. However, they do talk about saints sometimes. they talk about it in parallel because their interpretation of what a saint is different. In Protestant practices, a saint is anyone who has a committed relationship with God. Anyone. Basically, a saint is any good person. So you'll hear frequently comparisons about the living and the dead, the saint and the sinner. They'll flip saint and they'll use it as talking about anybody. We all might have saint qualities, but that doesn't mean that we are higher than anybody else. It doesn't mean that we're all dead. It talks about the good qualities and bad qualities. So they talk about how in each of us, we have a little bit of saint and a little bit of sinner. So that's the difference that the Protestants have when it comes to saints. Now, interestingly, a lot of churches, Protestant and not, are called Saint such and such. Saint George, Saint Michael, Saint John the Baptist, even though they don't necessarily worship saints. You might wonder, well, why? Why would it be Saint John the Baptist if Baptists don't believe in saints as in between or mediary? And the reason they do that is to remember the good things that people in history have done. Now, not every church is named after a saint. There's like churches Emmanuel and churches Bethel and different things like that don't necessarily have that saint name. So the church that I was a part of was a saint. That's their name. It was St. Peter's United Church of Christ. And it's not that we necessarily talked a whole bunch about Peter or what he did that was important, but that was an important person in Jesus's life. So they wanted to make sure that they recognized that. So they included him in the name of the church, and that's what they did it. Now, another difference that you will note with saints as far as in worship spaces, you will see in Catholic churches, sometimes they'll have statues or sculptures about different saints. You'll see statues of Mary, for example, and you will not see statues in the Protestant faith. And that would be because in the Protestant faith, they don't see saints as being biblically relevant. And they view that if you have statues, it's more of an idolatry thing. That they're encouraging the people with the statue to worship the saints instead. So in a Protestant church, you will probably see a cross, and you will hear them talk of Jesus and or God or the Holy Spirit. So they'll talk about one or any of the three in the Trinity, but they won't necessarily talk about saints. So that's the deep, dirty rundown of the Catholics and the Protestants and how their split came about. So to recap, it went Catholics, then Lutherans, and then Lutherans did a slight part with Calvinism. And then from Calvinism, there came a whole slew of different ones because it was all about that individual relationship, and they wanted the freedom to practice how they felt best and how they connected best. So that personal relationship and freedom to practice led to a whole slew of new ones. And then we brought it back around to the 5 solaces about the Protestants, the 5 different things that kind of all Protestant churches can agree upon, what makes it a Protestant over a Catholic church. And then we also talked about the saints and how they are different between Catholic and Protestant churches and practices. So we covered a lot today. And now I think we should go celebrate. So thanks so much for learning with me today. I look forward to talking to you next time. Bye-bye.